Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Mi nombre es Niño, soy el embajador de la Unión Europea en México y me da mucho gusto presentar la 11ª edición del Festival de Letras Europeas en el marco de la FIL, esta feria internacional que es la más grande e importante de América Latina. La delegación de la Unión Europea en México, junto con las embajadas de los Estados miembros de la Unión Europea, y saludo en particular la presencia de la Embajada de Irlanda, y junto con la FIL, por supuesto, organizamos anualmente desde el 2011 este festival. El año pasado fue un formato 100% virtual, este año es un formato híbrido y espero que el próximo vuelva a ser totalmente presencial. Y agradezco especialmente a John Boyne de haber emprendido el viaje desde Europa en esos tiempos complicados para estar con nosotros, y un agradecimiento, por supuesto, a Benito Taibo, quien va a moderar la mesa de esta noche. Este festival creo que es más necesario que nunca en este periodo en que salimos de un tiempo en el cual los contactos entre europeos y latinoamericanos han sido muy reducidos por la pandemia, y más que nunca el periodo actual de crisis, de emergencias multifacéticas, creo que requiere una reflexión, y qué mejor que la literatura para propiciarla. La literatura promueve y estimula el diálogo y el entendimiento entre unos y otros, y este Festival de Letras Europeas quiere ser un espacio de encuentro, de reflexión y discusión con los escritores que presentan sus obras de diferentes géneros literarios, poniendo en relieve la creatividad y la riqueza de la diversidad de lenguas y culturas de la Unión Europea. Este festival permite abrir un puente entre Europa y América Latina a través del diálogo entre reconocidos autores de 11 países diferentes que comparten con el público mexicano sus narraciones, creando así lazos de unión. Así que les invito a asistir a las transmisiones en la plataforma de la FIL, que tienen lugar por la noche a las 8, pero se pueden ver en cualquier momento después, y por supuesto asistir a la otra sesión presencial que tendrá lugar mañana con Pierre Ducrozet de Francia y Miguel Gané de España. Y por último quiero agradecer a la FIL por el apoyo brindado para organizar este festival, en particular a su directora Marisol Schulz y a Itzel Sánchez, coordinadora de este Festival de Letras Europeas. Muchísimas gracias.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Es un inmenso privilegio volver a estar en la feria. Después de un año, 8 meses de pesadilla, hoy volvemos al sueño de mirarnos a la cara, de ver no las sonrisas, pero casi las miradas cómplices de aquellos, y el brillo en la mirada de aquellos que están del otro lado, sabiendo que estamos en esta isla de imaginación, conocimiento, poesía, fantasía, en medio de un mar de barbarie. Han caído tiempos oscuros sobre nosotros y sin embargo la Feria Internacional del Libro vuelve a tomar su bandera y su maravilloso espíritu, que es el de la democrática República de los Lectores. Está con nosotros, ustedes lo conocen, John Boyne, y yo propongo que lo recibamos como se hace en Guadalajara. Es para mí un privilegio, de verdad, estar esta tarde en el Festival de las Letras Europeas con John. Lo leí en su momento con el niño de la pijama de rayas, como muchos de ustedes, y lo he seguido leyendo, todos aquellos títulos que trabaja incansablemente. Es un escritor profesional en el mejor sentido de la palabra. Trabajas todo el tiempo, pero yo creo que por lo menos los últimos libros traducidos al español tienen una similitud, tienen un punto de partida básico, que es Irlanda, lo que Irlanda significa para ti. Y yo pregunto, ¿qué significa? ¿Es un sueño? ¿Es una pesadilla? ¿Es un país dividido? ¿Qué es Irlanda para John Boyne?
Well, first, Well, firstly, thank you everybody for coming out here this evening. I've been in Guadalajara for 5 days now, and it's been such a pleasure, and people have been so welcoming. This is my last evening here, and it's been a pleasure to be here after such a long time in lockdown. What does Ireland mean to me? It means everything, really. I think it says something about me that I live in a house which is 10 minutes from the house that I grew up in Dublin, and where my parents still live, and 5 minutes from one sister, and 5 minutes from another sister. So Dublin, the south side of Dublin where I live, a place called Rathfarnham, is a place where I feel safe, I think. I love traveling, but I don't know about any of you, but sometimes when I'm traveling for a while, all I want to do is go home, you know. And when you walk in my front door, there's a little sculpture this concrete sculpture of a house that says there's no place like home. So Ireland is a country, I think, that I've had, in these 2 books, I've written a lot about many of the flaws that have been in the country over the years. But every country has its flaws. And it's actually not a country that I couldn't live in. It's very special to me and very important to me.
Voy a ir hacia atrás, hacia el niño con el pijama de rayas, porque quiero saber algo. ¿Cómo demonios se te ocurre hacer un cuento de hadas en medio de un campo de concentración? Bruno Bettelheim, el psicoanalista alemán, decía que tiene un libro muy importante llamado Psicoanálisis de los cuentos de hadas, y en él dice algo que me parece muy importante y que creo que tiene mucho que ver con este texto. En la fantasía se encuentran las armas y herramientas para enfrentar a los monstruos de la realidad. ¿Tú piensas que en esta alegoría que haces con el niño, con el pijama de rayas, estás intentando desde la fantasía encontrar o darle al lector armas y herramientas para enfrentar a esos monstruos?
Well, the Boyne pajamas probably started for me when I was about 15 years old. And it was the last day of school before our summer holidays. And my English teacher came in with a list of books. And he told us to write down these books and over the summer read some of them. And he wasn't going to test us on them or ask us what we'd read, but that it would be good for us to read some. And the first book I read was a book by Primo Levi. And the second book I read was a book by Elie Wiesel. And we hadn't studied the Holocaust in school at all. It wasn't really on the curriculum at the time. So this was my first introduction to a study of the Holocaust. And in the way that, when you're 15, 16 years old, something can really affect you and become a subject of real interest. It did for me. And for many years afterwards, I read, when a new biography, autobiography, work of nonfiction came out, I would read them. When documentaries were out, I would watch them, always trying to understand the subject better. And even though I was writing, and even as I got to the point of publishing, it wasn't a subject I thought I would write about myself for pretty obvious reasons. I'm not Jewish. I didn't have any family member who was either killed in the Holocaust or survived the Holocaust. But I guess what can happen to you as a writer, and with all of that reading and all of that self-education I had done over so long, it triggered just a very simple idea. And it was one evening I was at home, and I just had this idea of 2 boys sitting on either side of a fence, talking to each other. And I could just picture them instantly, and one wearing the uniform of striped pajamas, a little Jewish boy, and one dressed almost like I used to dress as a child, and them talking. And it seemed so simple to me. And the next morning I woke up and I just sat down and I started writing it. And I didn't know if it was going to be a story, a novel, what. I wouldn't normally just sit down and start writing a novel out of the blue. But I just started writing, and the story just sort of poured out of me. And writing it in the way that I did, it's subtitled A Fable. and almost with this kind of like very childlike, fairy tale-like beginning. One day when Bruno came home from school, he found Maria, the family's maid, putting his belongings in suitcases, even the things at the back of the wardrobe that belonged to him and were nobody else's business. And I got into the tone of it very quickly. And I felt like I knew who Bruno was. And the idea of, obviously there has been so much Holocaust-related literature, as there should be. But what I hadn't read before was the idea of this, of the child of a commandant, completely oblivious to what's going on. And in writing through naivety, which is what Bruno's perspective is, complete naivety and innocence and ignorance, it allows the reader to be one step ahead all the time. The reader will always know what's going on that Bruno doesn't. The reader sees those monsters that you refer to and is aware of those monsters, and Bruno isn't. And that's where I went on it. And my initial idea was it really was just going to be for young people and to give them sort of like a story about those times. And I honestly never expected 15 years later I'd still be sitting on a stage talking about it. I'm very grateful that I am, but the story just sort of poured out so easily that I think, you know, and I didn't plot it. So the ending, when it came, seemed like a very natural ending. And even though it's a dark ending and a scary ending for children, it's an authentic ending. And it's the only possible ending a story like this could have.
La literatura tiene la enorme posibilidad de ofrecer al que está del otro lado de las páginas. ¿Voy bien o voy más despacio? Bien. A través del que está del otro lado de las páginas, la posibilidad de la otredad. El meterte en los zapatos del que estás leyendo, el sentir con su piel, el mirar con sus ojos. Y yo te pregunto, ¿qué tanto te pusiste en los zapatos de estos personajes que describes tan espectacularmente en El niño con el pijama de rayas? Porque, porque hasta ahí.
Okay. Okay, well, you probably know that great quote of Gustave Flaubert, who said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Bruno, c'est moi, even though I wasn't there at the time, and it's a different time of history. This was the first book I had written for young people. And in the 4 books before, I had written historical stories that I had not been a part of at all. But the one thing that I had been in common with this is I had been a 9-year-old boy. And I just decided, right, okay, remember what it was like to be 9. And 9 is it's a wonderful age where you're really trying to understand the world better. And you don't want to be called a kid. You know, you want to be, if you're like your older sister is calling you a kid all the time, as Gretel does, you know, you're fighting back against that. And I based all of his characteristics on me. For example, he calls Gretel, his sister, the hopeless case, because he overhears adult phrases and adopts them into his vocabulary. Father's office is out of bounds at all times and no exceptions. When I was 9, my older brother called me a juvenile delinquent. And I went around calling everybody a juvenile delinquent. The parish priest lived next door to us, and I called the parish priest a juvenile delinquent one day. And I used to do this kind of thing. I used to hear these phrases and put them into my language. The book that Bruno carries around with him all the time is Treasure Island, which was my favorite book as a child. And coincidentally, a book I'm kind of slightly rewriting as a picture book for small children at the moment. Even the way he dresses, the way he talks. If you want to know who I was when I was 9, it's Bruno. So I just put myself in. He's also he's lonely and he's isolated. And it wasn't that I was isolated, I had a wonderful family, but I was a shy child and an introverted one, and somebody who really spent most of his time, not surprisingly perhaps, considering where I'm sitting now, in a library. And I felt more at home with books than I did with anything else. So you know, everything about him is me.
Qué maravilla. El cine es un monstruo en el buen sentido de la palabra. Cuando es adaptada tu obra al cine, supongo que esos que la miran en la pantalla vuelven al texto. Quiero decir, ¿has tenido esta relación doble, que esos cinéfilos se hayan acercado gracias al cine a tus textos?
One thing I found with the movie was when it came out in America, and myself and the director and the actors did a sort of, I don't know, like 10-city tour of the States, and we would go to cinemas to do a Q&A after the movie. And we'd arrive usually sort of in the last 5 minutes and be standing out there and then come up on the stage once the credits were coming up. And I could always tell from the room how many people had read the book and how many people hadn't, or, you know, in general, because you could tell by the silence that people who hadn't read the book, when it got to the ending, and then, you know, it ends and the titles come up and they're like, what? You know, this is a movie. Don't they escape? Isn't there a happy ending? And you know, there was that sense of kind of disbelief, which I think is one of the things that made the novel itself such a success, is that people got to the end of it, for example, and were so shocked by the end, even though it's the only possible ending that could be. But it's not your standard ending, and certainly not in a children's, what it was originally published as a children's book. And in fact, I might add that when I handed this book to my publisher, my then publisher, at the time, it was rejected. You know, it was my 4th book, and they said, no, it's not going to work. It's children aren't going to read this. And the editor said to my agent, whose son at the time was about 9, you would never give this to your child to read. And in fact, there was such antipathy towards it. When I read the email about how awful this book was and how I was told to put it in a drawer and never take it out again or I'd destroy my career, such as it was. And I remember thinking at the time, this is actually quite good, because I'd never had such a strong reaction to something before. And if you can get that strong a reaction, even if it's negative, you're also going to get it on the other side. And over the years, I've found that, well, you know, it's a pretty popular book, but there's also a lot of people who really don't like it and are really sort of have strong opinions about it, which is fine, because that's what literature is supposed to be. And you read it and you have that right to do that and to discuss literature in that way. I feel I've lost track of the original question. I'm just talking, but yeah.
No matter. Aprovechando que estamos solos y que no nos mira nadie, ¿te gustó la película?
I did like the movie. I thought it was really good. The way I looked at it was the same way that I look at translations. Cinema is just another translation. And when we read books in translation, for example, when I read a book in translation, I trust the translator. I don't speak any of the languages from around the world that I might read books by novelists I enjoy. And it's the same, you know, I trust the translator. And I think it's the same with cinema. You have to trust the director to make certain changes, and things that work well in the book might not work well on screen. Some things that work well on screen might not work well in the book. But the one thing that never changes is the book. I remember reading about a novelist who had a movie made of his book, and the movie was a famous disaster and just terrible. And somebody had said to him, you know, they destroyed your book. And he was like, actually, they did nothing to my book. My book is my book. It doesn't change in any way, shape, or form. So that's the way I looked at it going in. If the movie's a great success, well, that's because the book is great. And if the movie is a terrible failure, well, everybody will say, well, the book was, you know, they didn't do the book justice. I felt like it was a win-win situation either way. So.
Muy bien. ¿Qué tanto hay de ti en los libros que escribes, John? Y particularmente en los últimos libros que escribes. ¿Qué tanto estás tú ahí presente?
In the recent ones, yes. In the earlier books, no. With the exception, as I said, of like basing Bruno on myself. Most of my early books, the first 7, 8, 9, are generally historical books. And I kept myself very distant from them as a writer. I saw myself very much as a storyteller. I still do, actually. I think that's a good thing for a writer to be. I'd rather be called a storyteller than sort of a literary writer. You know, stories is what's important to me. And it wasn't until I wrote the book in the center here, A History of Loneliness, as it's called in English, and it's a slightly different title there in Spanish, but that was the first time I wrote a book, A, that was set in Ireland, and B, that was set around my own experiences. And I think I had got to a point in my life, I wrote it when I was about, 42 maybe, and I was certainly at a point in my life where I felt I was confident as a writer, experienced as a writer, and I wanted to make the books more intimate, really. I wanted to express more of myself in them. So a lot of my writer friends in Ireland were all writing about the banks, you know, and the financial crash. And nobody seemed to have really written about the child abuse scandals in the church. And it had been such a major story, like the major story in Ireland over the last maybe 50 years. And where I grew up, I mentioned that my next door neighbor was the parish priest, but my next door neighbor on the other side was 8 nuns. So, you know, I was right in the center of all of this. And I was at a Catholic school and was brought up Catholic and suffered at that school sexual abuse as a kid that I really struggled with through my late teens and my early 20s, really up till about, 30. And if, I don't know, I hope I'm not repeating myself if some of you were here the other day for the previous event, but it's not a book I could have written when I was in my 30s because I was too filled with rage against that particular machine. Whereas when I got a little older and wanted to write about it, I understood how novels need to work. And a novel can't be a diatribe. You know, it can't just be sort of, I'm going to smash the church down and sort of try to kick them out of Ireland. What I thought about was it's not so much about what the people did to children as why they did it. Those priests in my school, in other schools, in churches all around Ireland, they were born themselves as, they were children, they were teenagers. They were put into seminaries at very young ages. What was it that made them do these things? When we look at these kind of crimes, of course we condemn the crimes, but to stop the crimes being committed again, we have to have some understanding of what led them to happen in the first place. And so I started from the perspective of an elderly priest who has not himself committed any crimes. He has not molested any children. He believes he has lived a good and virtuous and kind life. But as the novel progresses, what we, the reader, realize and what he realizes as he narrates his story is how complicit he has been in the crimes that have taken place. Because he has known they've happened. And over the course of his life, he's done nothing to help. And I've always taken this view of Ireland and of the church in Ireland, that it's really a very small minority of priests who committed the crimes. But it's a vast majority of priests and non-priests, just teachers, parents, everybody, who knew, police, the Gardaí, who knew what was going on and did nothing about it. And the point of my book is to say effectively, look, if you knew that crime was going on and you did nothing about it, you're just as guilty as the person who did it. And that's what Odrin, the priest at the center of this book, has to come to terms with. And he has to realize that, no, he's not this heroic, kind, gentle, decent man that he wants to present himself to be. He's a coward. He's a moral coward. And he's taken these secrets and he's looked away. Every time he's seen something, he's walked away from it.
Un país de abusadores y de cómplices simultáneamente.
Ja.
Voy a decir una idea que no es original mía y justo por eso lo digo, para que luego no me acusen de plagio. Tuvo una entrevista con un muy buen amigo mío, hoy, creo que fue hoy o ayer, en donde hablaron de el simbolismo de los uniformes en la historia de Irlanda. Soldados ingleses, abusadores, magistrados con togas, el uniforme de los magistrados, y curas con sotanas, el uniforme de los curas. O sea, hay toda una simbología alrededor del uniforme en la historia de los abusos, no solo de los abusos de la iglesia, sino de los abusos de la milicia y de los abusos de los magistrados. ¿Qué te representan a ti los uniformes?
Yeah, this was an idea that really struck me when I was writing a young adult book, some of you might have read, called The Boy at the Top of the Mountain, which is also set during the Second World War. And there's a moment in that book where the young character at the center of the story, Piero, who was living in the Berghof, you know, the eagle's nest, that was Hitler's retreat, because he's the nephew of the housekeeper there, where Hitler gives him his first Hitler Youth uniform. And the boy is so thrilled. When he puts it on, he goes immediately from being this very kind, gentle child to turning into something else the minute he puts this uniform on. And it struck me very much when I was writing that scene about uniforms. And I thought the same when I was writing A History of Loneliness, that the authority given to people wearing uniforms is enormous. And I think we all do it. I know I do it. A few days before I had to come to Mexico, I had to go down to the Garda station near me for a reason I won't go into, but I had to present something to the Gardas. And the minute I walked into the Garda station, I'm immediately feeling I'm on my best behavior. You know, that like, I feel like I've done something wrong. And I'm talking to the policeman, and who's like 20 years my junior. And I'm being the most respectful, polite version of myself I can possibly be. And I think we all kind of have that idea of uniforms, that they do present this. And the priests in Ireland during those years, once they put that collar around their neck, the authority that was given to them. I mean, I can just remember like growing up like as an altar boy, and as I say, in the parish that I lived in, sometimes, for example, because my family was close to the parish priest because of his living next door, I remember when one of my grandparents died, and the priest came in like a week later or something to say a prayer in the say a mass in the house for the family. And honestly, you know, even though my mother's mother had just died, the entire week was spent wallpapering the house, you know, painting everything, cleaning every item of furniture. This arrival of the priest was basically like the Pope arriving in the house, even though he only lived next door. And just this sense of overwhelming authority that he had. And he was a lovely man, I have to say. He was a really nice, gentle, kind guy. So there was nothing scary about him. But you just sort of felt that authority. And for a lot of, you know, in those years, a lot of young guys who became priests, they went from being sort of like a 16-year-old at home one day to being a 23-year-old with a collar who everybody in their parish is suddenly treating like the most important person. And I think that kind of does something to your head a little bit, you know, that power trip that you can go on.
Escribir fácil, y permítanme poner comillas, es lo más difícil del mundo. Porque para escribir fácil necesitas conocer todas las palabras difíciles, complejas, inextricables que debes evitar. Se agradece en tu literatura esta posibilidad de la aparente sencillez, porque se nota que detrás hay un trabajo enorme. Tu mesa de trabajo está llena de libretas de apuntes, de mapas, de compases?
No.
Okay.
I keep a very clean desk. Firstly, I think the smoother a book is to read, the harder it's probably been to write. If it's flowing along, if the story flows, if the dialogue flows, if the characters seem authentic, then I think that shows how much work has actually gone into it. But for me, I'm not a big notes kind of person. I'm a very instinctive writer. I very much work from the heart rather than the head. I consider myself emotional rather than intellectual. And I'm very happy just sort of sitting at my desk with my computer and letting the story I get very focused. I don't like noise around me. I know one of my fellow Irish writers, Roddy Doyle, he always puts on music in the morning before starting to write. And he can't write, as far as I know, without the record player being on. CD player. Oh my God, I'm sorry. What age am I? But I can't do that. I have to have silence when I'm writing. But I get completely focused on it, and I don't like a lot of mess around me. I like it all just to be there on the screen. If you saw my computer, if you saw my office at home, you'd say this guy is crazy. Everything in my house is so ordered. I'm very OCD. Even my bookshelves, everything is. I'll just tell you this because it's so stupid. So I have, obviously the different rooms in my house, and I have a lot of books. I have about 3,000 books. But I divide them into kind of geographical areas. So I have the room that has all the Irish fiction, the British fiction, translated fiction, and so on. And then within that, it's ordered by author alphabetically. And then within that, it's ordered chronologically. So, I can find, I know it sounds crazy, but I did this piece for the Irish Times, a newspaper, last year, where I went to 6 other writers' houses to see how they, I'm really veering off topic, but to see how they organized their bookcases. And everybody does it in a different way. But I thought the challenge was, if you've got a lot of books, as I bet everybody here does by the nature of us being here, it's whether you can find the book you're looking for. So I set each writer the task. I would go around their house, I would find a book, and then I would tell them to find it. And I would see how long it took them. And Sebastian Barry, I think it took him about 10 minutes, because his books are just, I wanted to just move in and sort the whole thing out. It was a mess. Cecilia Ahern, she found her book in an instant. So yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm really going off topic, but I'm ordered is the answer to the question. So, except when I'm answering questions, obviously.
No. No te sales del tema porque esta es una feria de lectores y sabemos de qué se trata. Yo voy a evitar invitarte a mi biblioteca para que no te den un infarto. Porque puede ser, sé dónde está todo, pero lo hago con mucha calma. Me sorprendiste enormemente, John, porque se puede narrar desde muchos lugares. Se puede narrar omnipresentemente, con la vista de Dios hacia esos pequeños personajes que has creado. Se puede narrar desde un lado, ¿no? Se puede narrar como un espectador. Y de repente encuentro a un hombre que narra desde el vientre de una madre. ¿De dónde surge esta idea? Ese narrador que está en el vientre de una madre. O sea, ustedes, bueno, no se imaginen. Escuchemos.
Well, this is this book here. So, when I finished A History of Loneliness, and as I mentioned, it was my first Irish-based novel, by having written one, it seemed to open up so many memories in my head, and this dam of all my own childhood stories and everything. And I immediately wanted to continue writing about Ireland. So I wrote, I'd written about the church, but I started writing this in the, about 6 months before, it was in 2015 or late 2014, six months before the equal rights marriage referendum in Ireland that allowed gay marriage. And I was thinking about how, when I was in university, homosexuality wasn't decriminalized until 1993. And yet, in 2015, 22 years later, only 22 years later, we were about to become the first country in the world to vote by public vote for equal rights marriage. And it was obvious that it was going to pass. It just never seemed unlikely in any way. And for a country like ours, which had such a history of conservatism, of Catholicism, to be the first country to vote for that seemed to me an extraordinary thing. So I wanted to look at the history of Ireland over a reasonable expanse and to see how the country had changed. So I started in this book with 1945, the end of the war. It's narrated, as Benito said, by Cyril, who at the time is still in his mother's womb. And we follow 70 years of his life, from 1945 until that equal rights marriage referendum. And Cyril is gay, and we follow the story of Ireland's history through that, the sociology of Ireland, how it was such a difficult place for gay people to grow up, even up until, 15 years ago or something. And how Cyril has to leave Ireland at times to live his life in the way that he needs to live it. And it's structured in these 10 chapters at 7-year leaps. So we see where he is every year, or every 7th year of his life. But that first section, there are 10 long chapters, that first section is all about his mother, his birth mother, and how she is banished from the parish in West Cork for being 16 and unmarried, and comes to Dublin to get a job. And at the end of this chapter, there's a huge moment of violence. But in this moment of violence, she also gives birth to our narrator. And it's the second book I've written about Ireland, but and there's some dark moments in it, but it's the first book I've written which also has, I think, a lot of humor in it, especially in Cyril's younger age, when he's 7 and when he's 14, and living with his adoptive parents who are quite eccentric. I think it's quite funny. It's supposed to be funny. And then there are darker sections because then we get to like the 80s and the AIDS crisis and so on, and so many other difficult things for him throughout his life.
Yo siempre digo que esta feria es la mejor feria del mundo, porque está construida por lectores, porque hay más lectores que en ninguna otra feria del mundo. Y si te parece bien, les damos la palabra a los lectores, para que ellos pregunten. ¿Sí? ¿Tenemos micrófonos? Sí. ¿Alguien quiere contar, preguntar a John Boyne, aprovechando que está aquí con nosotros esta tarde? Ahí tenemos...
¿Debo de preguntar en inglés o en español?
Either is fine because it's... Yeah.
Okay. Entonces, ¿usted cree que esta historia del nazismo haya traspasado a otras novelas? Porque, por ejemplo, usted habla sobre esta cuestión en su segundo libro del que platicó usted, que esta culpa que sienten que las personas, aunque no vean, aunque sepan qué está pasando y no hagan nada, son culpables. Es lo mismo que pasa con la SS, con las personas en los campos de concentración. ¿Piensa usted que después de El niño de pijama de rayas se hayan traspasado a sus otras historias estas experiencias?
The books. I think it's a theme that I think it's a theme that runs through my books, definitely, and it's subconscious more than anything else. It's not that I set out each time to do that, but I've written a lot of books where I think Odrin in that book, The History of Loneliness, is about the most typical of all my characters, in that it's an elderly person looking back at life and realizing they've been part of something enormous and have done nothing to help. Now, in Bruno's case, in Striped Pajamas, he's only 9 years old. There's nothing he could really do. But in a book like The Absolutist, we see that theme there. We definitely see it in the 2 novels that are standing up here. But I think it's good. I think it's natural that a writer will have running themes running through his or her own books. But oftentimes they get pointed out to you by other people, rather than you recognizing them yourself and saying, I'm going to make sure that moment goes in. Or there always seems to be issues of loyalty as well in all my books, and moments of betrayal. I think the moment in Striped Pajamas when Bruno and Shmuel are in the kitchen and eating the chicken, and Lieutenant Kotler discovers them, and Bruno betrays his friend and says he doesn't know him, that he didn't give him the food. There's always that big moment of betrayal of friendship. Again, it happens in The Absolutist, with the relationship between Tristan and Will. It happens in Heart's Invisible Furies, where the betrayer is really the narrator, Cyril, because of his friendship with his best friend Julian, who he adores and he's in love with, and who Julian is straight, and Cyril, just marries his sister, because he wants to be close to him, and which is a terrible thing to do. So he's not a hero, really, but a lot of people would have done that. So there are themes, I think, that run through each book.
Mencionaste que fuiste un niño introvertido desde pequeño. ¿Qué tanto crees que tuvo que ver esto en tu desarrollo como escritor?
It probably affected it a lot, because I spent most of my teenage years sitting in my bedroom writing stories, when maybe there was lots more fun things I could have been doing as a teenage boy. But I was so passionate about it, though. All I wanted was to have those books on the shelf. Nothing else mattered to me, and I knew it would take time. So I think my introversion was quite good for me, because it allowed me to focus on my work. Whereas when eventually it all worked out and I was being published and I was traveling so much and talking to audiences, you have to change completely, because you have to present an entirely different side of your character. The idea, 30 years ago, the idea of something like this would have scared me. This morning I was at a high school with a couple of hundred teenagers. The idea of that would have made me want to run, as far as the hills. But you eventually just kind of build up a way to approach these things. And that I think in my private life, I'm still quite solitary and introverted. But when I'm in rooms like this talking about books, or at festivals talking about books, or at dinner last night with my publisher talking about books, different person. I'm like, yeah, I'm really into it. Whereas I'm just not good on the small talk. I'm not good on, I'm not good at parties. I'm the worst. Never invite me to a party. I'm just terrible. I'll just stand there looking awkward and, envying the waiters because they've got something to do at least. So, yeah, anyway.
A ver, la compañera, por favor.
Hi, I was wondering, as a published author, do you have any advice for us who are studying or in the process of becoming a writer, by creating, or on your experiences, any advice that you can give us?
Yes, I do. Firstly, number one is be reading all the time. There's too many young people I find when I go into universities to give talks who say they want to be writers, and I ask them what they're reading, and they're not reading anything, and they haven't read anything in ages, and they've always got a reason why. Or if they have read something, it's something very obvious and very new, and they haven't read all the great books. Not that you can have read all of them, but they're not interested. Be reading all the time. Be reading more than you write. They say you should read 5,000 books before you try to write one. So that's number one. The second thing is, I think writing groups are fantastic. Small writing groups, 5, 6 people, sharing work with each other. Writing is meant to be given out. It is not meant to be put in a drawer. And forming one of those groups or joining one of those groups and listening to what people say. But I've always found in those groups, you learn more from reading the other students' work and recognizing what's working and what's not working, and being able to talk about that in a room, than you do necessarily from them reading your work. And even I've taught classes over the years occasionally at universities, and I'll teach a class, say, for 6 months of 21-year-olds, and I'll be reading their work, and I'll recognize something in it that's like a mistake or something that's not working right, and I'll say to myself, God, I'm doing that actually as well. You know, you never stop learning, and you still, you know, you can learn at any age from new people. So I think writing groups are good, and if you are in one, when people are talking about your work, don't say anything, just listen. You don't have to agree with everything, but you have to be able to filter it. But there's no point when somebody criticizes something, there's no point saying, no, what I meant was, because if you're sitting at home tonight reading one of my books and you don't like something in it, I'm not there to say, no, what I meant was. You know, you have to, if you want praise, give it to your mum. If you want real serious criticism, give it to people you don't know and hear what they say and filter it. And they're not always right. You know, not every criticism is correct, and you'd be right to reject some of it, but be able to hear it. And third, last thing is just write something every day. A great Irish writer, Maeve Binchy, I remember years ago going to a talk when I was a teenager that she gave, and she said the single thing that I think was the best piece of advice I ever heard from a writer. She said, if you write 1 page a day for a year, at the end of the year, you'll have 365 pages, which is longer than the average novel. And it seems so simple, and yet it's so true. You can write a page a day. There'll be days where it's harder. The first third of writing a novel is so great, it's exciting. You're convinced you're writing the greatest novel of all time. The third third is great because the end is in sight, and you're looking forward to the rewriting. But that middle third, you know, where the story is really building, and where you're sitting down at your desk every day and you're too far from the start to give up and too far from the end to see it in sight, that's what separates the writers from the non-writers. And you have to be able to say, even if you're not in the mood, I am going to write my page today, and my book will be 1 page longer tomorrow morning than it was this morning.
Nos tenemos que ir, ya me pasaron el boletito de que nos tenemos que ir, pero no soporto la tentación, de preguntarte si no es un acto de mala fe. ¿Has leído el Ulises de Joyce? 1. Y 2, ¿lo disfrutaste?
No. I haven't.
Bien.
I've read Dubliners, I've read Portrait of the Artist, but I've never read Ulysses. I have a most beautiful edition of Ulysses on my shelf. I know exactly where to find it at home. And the chances of that book ever being pulled off that shelf, I have to say, are slim. I'd love to, you know, it's one of those books I'd love to have read. I remember a year ago, I read Moby Dick for the first time. I'd never read Moby Dick, but I got this gorgeous edition of it. And I thought, right, I'm going to read it. And I thought it was going to be a slog. I thought it was going to be really hard work. And it turned out to be one of the great reads of my life. And, you know, something is a classic for a reason. So maybe I should read Ulysses. But no, sorry. I hang my head in shame. So.
No tengas prisa. Muchas gracias al señor embajador de la Unión Europea por acompañarnos esta tarde para inaugurar este Festival de las Letras Europeas, y sobre todo muchas gracias a John Boyne por estar con nosotros en la democrática República de los Lectores. Gracias a todos.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.